Hi, I'm Ellora. I'm a consultant here at Keystone Strategy, and I work in our digital transformation practice. So Keystone actually has a long history of doing digital transformation work at a number of leading clients across a bunch of different industries, right? Digital health, you've got CPG companies like Nike, and a really common trend as part of those projects was that cultural transformation can be really difficult for companies. It's not just about deploying technology, but there's actually a transformative element of how you actually think about and apply that technology within your company. And so we realized it'd be really impactful to have some actual concrete research, something a little bit more systematic to try and figure out, what is the difference? What are the actual cultural elements that are core to being able to effectively use data and manage a digital transformation so that you're actually getting impact out of it? Our founder and chairman, Marco Iansiti, has been doing work in digital transformation for 30 years or so. And so one of his key insights has been that a lot of digital transformation is as much about actually transforming organizations to kind of have a different organizational architecture as much as it is about the actual, putting in a new set of databases and connecting them across the organization. So what he finds is that organizational architecture really mirrors digital architecture and vice versa. They're kind of mutually reinforcing. And so as we saw a number of different companies trying to transform their digital infrastructure, but wondering why people aren't really using it, it was kind of clear to us from the beginning that a lot of that had to do with their organizational architecture and kind of their culture, whether or not their culture was actually used to leveraging the data that they'd now connected across all these organizational silos. Four key differences, 4 areas of extreme difference between companies that are really digitally mature and companies that are a little bit on the earlier side of their transformations. The first is in a growth mindset and in their attitudes towards change and innovation. So companies that were data leaders often viewed change slightly differently than their lagging competitors. They saw change as kind of inevitable, and that made it so that they were really, really open to changing and learning about themselves and learning how they were actually performing in the market so that they could improve. They really had a growth mindset about these kinds of changes and about being able to take risks and be able to make innovations happen. The second piece was kind of one of the major rules of data and how they treated data at the company. Data was used to create a shared context and kind of a transparent context. So there is this idea that there's nothing to hide and everyone should have access to the same set of data and use it to draw, creative and innovative conclusions that allow them to collaborate with each other more effectively. So you would see companies that were on the leading edge here, to them, the idea that someone could actually hoard data within an organization because data was powerful was, it was anathema. It was insane for them. They could never really conceive of trying to keep data hidden away unless it was for legitimate ethical or moral or legal reasons. The third piece that we often found at leading companies that was really differentiated was just the amount of measurement that they did. These companies really wanted to measure everything, and that kind of goes back to this fundamental belief that if the world around you is constantly changing, then it makes sense that you want to measure and understand how you're doing so that you can best, meet the new trajectory of the world that you're operating in. And so you saw these companies that were kind of constantly measuring things, but they didn't treat these measurements like an assessment. They weren't a way to measure someone as good or bad or, overperforming or underperforming. In fact, at those companies, it was more of a realistic measurement so that you could meet the changing tides. Then the last piece was just the role that KPIs played. A lot of the organizations we spoke to theoretically had KPIs at the highest levels of the organization. That's pretty constant. Everyone knows they should have KPIs, so they do. But what was really differentiated at leading organizations was that every single person that we talked to could explain how their KPIs actually rolled up to those broader organizational KPIs. So they were extremely aligned to every individual metric or goal was tied back to some part of the organizational strategy in a way that lagging companies sometimes fall down on. So at a lagging company, you might see a KPI established at the very highest levels of the company, but that KPI might be a little tougher to measure or a little tougher to quantify and hard to break down into concrete chunks, so that when leaders actually went down to their teams and asked for help in actually making that KPI happen, people didn't know how to measure whether or not it was happening. And so what happens in those cases is you see that people in these organizations revert back to process. And so the KPI becomes, I worked really hard at this, as opposed to we're having the outcomes that we're wanting to have, and we're actually driving outcomes in the way that we're expecting. We have a company where one of their strategic areas is improving customer satisfaction, right? Usually what will happen then is they'll say, okay, this is the summary score for our customer satisfaction rates. And they'll task each of their team members to kind of say, how can you impact this customer satisfaction score, right? Everybody knows the calculation for the customer satisfaction score, so the question is, how can each of these teams impact it? So you might have the head of product saying, okay, well, previously we've measured product in X, Y, and Z ways, but now we're going to incorporate customer satisfaction survey ranks into this, right? And that'll be one of our key KPIs. And so then each of the product teams will take that on for their own personal part of the product. That'll roll all the way back up to customer satisfaction, right? And they'll know that, and they'll kind of add that to their measurements for that quarter or half or whatever the unit of time is. You might also have, sales reps or account reps or customer service teams who, really, really take this to heart and start breaking down what is the entire customer journey and how can we have a predicted impact in each step of that customer journey, right? And they'll actually be leading growth teams that have set metrics for different pieces that hypothetically should roll up to that customer satisfaction journey. And I think what's really interesting there is they'll make all of these plans, and then they will measure what's happening over time, and they'll have kind of a set touch point where they'll say, did this work or not? And if it didn't work, they'll say, how can we adjust it? They'll try to understand the root cause of why something didn't work and adjust to incorporate that root cause into their plans rather than kind of scrapping something that didn't work whole cloth. Everything is kind of a chance to learn and grow, as opposed to, a yes-no answer of like this worked or this didn't work. Well, there were two things. So one was the idea that there were companies that had actually really successfully transformed. I think a lot of the times when we see papers about, an agile culture or a digital culture, we often assume that those are companies that started with zero technical debt and zero cultural debt, and so of course it's really easy for them to take on the best practices. But what we found was actually there's a lot of large enterprises that have been successful in adopting elements of these four cultural pillars, right? So that's really promising, I think, because it means that companies that are interested in digital transformation can actually try and grow and develop and not worry that, they're doomed to failure just because they might have a richer history, So that was one thing. And then the other piece, I think, is just how much culture really mattered at these leaders. So in organizational culture, there's a concept called the SHINE model. The SHINE model basically says an organizational culture is made up of almost like three concentric circles, right? So you've got core beliefs, and then you've got like speech and how people actually talk about those beliefs, and then you've got behaviors kind of at the outside. That's how everything manifests. And when you have a strong culture, all of those three things are in alignment. And what you find is that at these leaders, even beyond these like four specific things that we've outlined, leaders just really believe in the power of culture. The people that we spoke to at leading companies could very often like list off not just their cultural values, but like examples of how they were used to make decisions in everyday life. The culture was really, really emphasized at those companies and was a core part of how they actually made decisions and went about their day-to-day practice of doing their jobs. Whereas at lagging companies, sometimes you would hear, well, I know we have cultural values, but we don't use them to make decisions. Like, we say that we want to do X, Y, and Z, but actually I'm seeing something else. And so what you're hearing there is actually disconnect between the core beliefs, what's said, and what's actually realized in behavior. And most of the time it's because people kind of know what they should say about their culture. People often feel like they should be expressing that we have a data-driven culture today. That's important. And I think one important thing to realize is it's okay to take a step back and realize there's a lot of people out there who are struggling with this cultural journey. And the best first step is to really sit down and take a look at your culture and say, how do we need to change and how do we actually get there? So the key takeaway from the research is that digital transformation is really possible at these companies, and cultural transformation is this core element, and it is also extraordinarily possible. We've seen plenty of examples of companies that have managed to actually transform to a higher level of data maturity and data cultural maturity. But getting that transformation does actually require dedicated effort. It's not something that will happen just because you decide to implement a bunch more dashboards or start actually opening up the data access. Those are all key critical components. Making sure you're deploying the right technology and architecting it the right way are really critical. However, adding that last piece of culture and of innovation process and making sure that you have a holistic approach to digital transformation is absolutely critical in ensuring that you're successful in your transformation efforts.